Our guest. I'm delighted to see so many faces that I don't recognize. Judging by the number of phone calls that I've received in the past few days, well, I know that our universities and colleges are well represented here, as well as one of the gifted and talented programs from North Glen. I wanted to make a comment about the donuts out in the hall. Those are intended to stay you over until lunchtime. Those were really intended as a lunch. For those of you who haven't been here before, I'd just like to say a couple of words about our program. Our program is intended for two things. First thing, it's intended to be educational and to allow us to look at what the future could be. And the second thing, it's intended as a networking forum. And I'd like to challenge every one of you here at Coors to meet someone new and exchange some of your ideas. Our speaker this morning, many of you had an opportunity to hear him last year while he was here. He's a graduate at the University in Boulder. He is easy to track. You pick up almost any electronic magazine throughout the year, and you'll see his name mentioned. He's on the forefront of technology. I would like you to help me welcome Dr. Alan Kay. Alan?
So I discovered it's not very easy to stride confidently down the aisle with a full cup of coffee. Thanks. Well, last year when I was here, we talked about what I think computers really are, which are not gadgets for number crunching or even things made out of silicon, but to all of us that use them, computers are, to us, what appears on the screen, what we can move around. In other words, computers are really a theatrical experience as we use them today. Even people who design them really don't know what's going on inside except abstractly. You have a machine that can execute 6 million instructions per second, even when it appears to be doing nothing, then it's very, very difficult to understand what the heck is going on in there. And so in order to understand computers, we've been forced to find simpler ways of relating to them. And one of the ways that we worked out at Xerox PARC many years ago was a way of relating to them as though there were a stage that actors could appear on, the actors could wear costumes, the actors could be influenced, and that off stage was all the other stuff, the scene shop and so forth, that you didn't want to see most of the time, and that what you had was not reality that we think of in the objective world, but the kind of reality that we have in the theater. In other words, in a theatrical presentation, you can show magical things, and the audience will go along with it as long as you don't violate expectation. So one of the things you always do in theater is to try and let people know in the first few minutes what the rules of the game are. And if you don't violate those, they'll go along with whatever you do. The worst thing you can ever do in theater is at some crux moment when the heroine is in trouble and the train is bearing down on her, is to go to the next scene and she appears without a hair ruffled, and she said, "Oh, I got out of that one fairly easily." The audiences won't stand for that because a rabbit out of the hat has been pulled that wasn't part of the original premise. That's why Superman always has to have kryptonite. If you have an all-powerful being without any weaknesses, you don't have a show. So what we did at Xerox was to work on one part of this theater idea, and it was the part of the theater where the actors on stage were pretty much like puppets. In other words, you as the audience moved these actors around on stage. And so you had something also that could be compared to the top of your desk. The things, the structures inside the computer, the processes that were going on, were objectified into things that appeared to you to be like objects. And of course, the modern equivalent of what we did at Xerox PARC is the Macintosh. How many people have used a Macintosh or familiar with that? Well, that is the idea, where whatever it is inside has been projected into a much simpler representation that you can move around as though it were a real thing. And the movement and the influence of these things is tried to be made as uniform as possible across applications. So we have this interesting thing that happens on the Macintosh is a remarkable number of people who use the Macintosh have never opened a manual. And in fact, if you think about it, that only is really good if everything important about the Macintosh can be figured out without the manual. And we know that isn't true. I discovered when my secretaries learned the Macintosh, I was really intrigued that they never opened the manual at all. And they were able to do documents and everything else, but they never learned, for instance, about extending selections. As you know, on the Macintosh, that's done with the Shift key and a click. And there's no way of finding out that that works on the Macintosh without opening the manual. So you see, if you do a system that's easy to use, you have to go all the way with it. The next versions of the Macintosh will actually try and do away with the manual, since people hardly use it now, and the few little things that are not totally obvious will actually be part of the user interface to be found out. So what we get from this is a way of dealing with computer objects that works until the resources available to you gets to be about 100. I think if you realize that being able to browse, for instance, without having to know the names of different files and so forth is wonderful. We all remember where we put a book at home by its position. Now, it works perfectly well until you get several thousand books and it starts breaking down. The same thing happens with this objectification idea on the Macintosh, is as it gets hooked up to a network, and as we discovered at Xerox PARC 10 years ago, that this simplistic way of looking at communicating with computers starts to break down. Right now, it's not terribly important because networking is something that the micro industry is just starting to discover. In 5 years from now, it's going to be critical. And I predict that the whole way of dealing with computers is going to completely change from what now I would term manipulation. You have tools, you use your hands, you move things around as though they're real. It's going to change to management. In other words, I'll give you an example. Today, there are slightly more than 10,000 different databases that you can dial into via the phone. Now, on most personal computers, the largest database you can have is about 2,000 records. So most personal computers like the IBM PC and the Macintosh can't even have a database that has one record for every resource that you can now dial in on the phone. How are we going to find out? There might be something useful there. When the resources get up into the 50s and the hundreds of thousands, we now have a completely different problem of getting to things that might be of use to us. And at Xerox PARC, we started thinking about this problem and decided that what would probably happen is we would change from this way of dealing with things directly to something more like managing projections of ourselves. Slaves, if you will, of the computer. Everybody would love to have slaves, but we don't want them to be human beings anymore. But we'd like to have servants around that can carry out extensions of our purpose. I'm going to show you some examples of those. So, for instance, one of the things that we did at MIT 5 years ago was a system that you had an agent, and this agent could learn your preferences for news of various kinds. In fact, the system was called NewsPeak. And over a period of some weeks, it would learn your preferences for news in a variety of ways. And every night, it would spend all night long logging into different news networks. It would log into AP, it would log into the New York Times, it would log into Nexus. And what it would be doing is looking for things that it thought you might be interested in. And it wouldn't be just looking directly for things. You might like to read about plane crashes or invasions of Afghanistan or things like that. But it also will be looking for wild card things, things of general interest, and things that conform to your reading patterns. And in the morning, when you come down, you would wind up with, on your screen, with something like your personal version of USA Today. Because this agent that we did at MIT would read these articles, because it had to read them in some fashion in order to retrieve them. If it saw a name like Mitterrand, it would look on a disk that we had that had 42,000 pictures of famous people, and it would find a picture of Mitterrand, not the last one it showed you of Mitterrand. We got this from the Associated Press. And it would use that, and if there was a place name like Paris, France, it would go to another disk that we got from J.P. Donnelly and find a set of maps so you could see where things were related. So in other words, it was doing color-related things as well as just retrieving an article. And the whole thing was put together and related so that topics that were happening over in this article were related dynamically with topics over here. And that's what you'd see each morning. Now, it also looked at your electronic mail. So, for instance, the headline in your personal newspaper sometimes would read, instead of the Russians have invaded Afghanistan again, it might read, your 3 o'clock meeting has been canceled. Because the agent might have decided that that was the important thing of the day that you had to know about. There might be a sidebar that said, your children slept well last night. In other words, news is something that has lost its meaning to us. It's hard for us to remember that the original reasons for newspapers back before the telegraph was actually for pamphleteering, which is actually quite a different way of conveying things. Pamphleteering is an extension of the book. And most newspapers back before the telegraph were extensions. They were essentially fast books. They were a way of getting essays and thoughts about various things. And it is remarkable to realize that our Constitution was actually designed and debated in public in the New York newspapers. It's a collection of essays called the Federalist Papers, written by John Jay, Hamilton, and Madison. And these were public. This is not something that wasn't a thing. These were published as they wrote them in the paper so that all of the citizens could read them. Now we relegate them to something that we're supposed to learn in school. But back then, that was news. And it was the telegraph that fragmented the news into what it is today. And once you have you have this kind of tyranny of once you decide that a newspaper or a magazine has to appear on a regular basis, it requires the people who do that to create news. Right? News, things are always going on, but in fact, now when you have to fill space, it doesn't matter whether things are interesting or not, because the space must be filled, and now news has been created as an idea. As electronic media is going to redefine news again. News is once again going to mean those things that are of interest to you. So it's personal news rather than interest to people in general. It's a whole different ballgame. So that's an example of an agent. The agent partially decides on what to get for you on the basis of watching you read the newspaper. So every couple of weeks it may say to you, I noticed you haven't been reading about terrorist attacks anymore. Are you no longer interested in those? Should I stop retrieving? You can say, oh no, I still love reading about crime and violence. Please retrieve that for me. I just haven't had time to devote to that. So now the point of this is that although it's quite possible to do what I just described to you by hand, there's nothing to prevent you from going in each night and spending 12 to 18 hours logging into all of those networks. That's what people do today. And you can find all of those things, and if you had a long checklist of all the things that you're interested in, that would give you a set of keys with it, but you're not going to do it. You're going to do it. And in fact, so the message of networking is that we have to go from direct manipulation to indirect management. And the difficulty with this, as we discovered building this Newspeak agent at MIT 5 years ago, was that there is nothing in artificial intelligence that is at all helpful. We built this as an expert system. So that is the artificial intelligence technology that's available for dealing with something like this. And we found out a lot about expert systems, and most of what we found out we didn't really want to know. And I came out of the experience feeling that expert systems were the designer genes of computer science. In other words, they're a phrase that conjures up much more than what they can do. In fact, expert systems to me are just large programs. And rule-based systems are just a way of organizing large programs in a way that doesn't get you into trouble for a while. But as far as having any overlap with the idea of intelligence, expert systems have none. And the characterization I had of them was that they were like termites. Now, you probably know that termites are the only species on Earth besides mankind that builds structures out of the true arch. Or maybe you didn't know that, but they do. And termite hills in Australia in particular are amazing. There are on the order of 10 million termites living in a hill. The hills are air-conditioned, and the air conditioning is not gratuitous. It is something that is part of what it means to build a termite hill. And whenever you get 4 or 5 termites together, they immediately start building arches. And these termites are these honeycomb structures of true catenary arches, like our Gothic cathedrals are built out of, and are completely marvelous. There are very few mammals that you could compare to what termites and other social insects are able to do. But in fact, they aren't intelligent. They don't learn, and everything that termites can do is built into their nervous system, wired into their DNA. Now, I think you may also know about insects, as they have this remarkable structure that insect brains are derived embryologically different from ours. And the bug in, if I can use that expression when talking about insects, in the design of insects is that the ganglia from which insect brains are derived happens to surround the esophagus. Okay, because it didn't matter when they were worms. But as they got smarter and smarter and got bigger and bigger brains, you have this remarkable thing that the smarter an insect gets, the less able it is to eat. And that, in fact, is why spiders, which are quite smart insects, have to dissolve their food externally. They digest the food first and then suck it up as a kind of soup because their esophagus is almost closed. And so nature, in order to get us, which we think of as being lots smarter than insects, it's not clear yet. We've only been around for a few million years, and they've been around for 350. But we think of ourselves as being much smarter than insects because we can learn things. In order to have a brain that can learn, nature had to back its way completely out of that pathway of invertebrates and start over again. It had to go to organisms much simpler than the invertebrates in order to eventually get mammals. And so what I got out of this experience was, gee, in the 50s, the artificial intelligence people claimed that they would have superhuman intelligences. In fact, there isn't any philosophical reason why some arbitrary computer in the future can't be much smarter than us. Right? Just because a brick, when you look at it, is fairly obvious of how you build a wall, and people have figured out how to build dog houses, but it took 1,000 years to go from Romanesque architecture to the Gothic, and that was using the same bricks. So in any complex organization of things, architecture dominates the material. So, and the people who worked with computers in the 1950s realized very early that there are no real limitations to what could be built out of a computer, and therefore there is no reason to suspect that computers couldn't be much smarter than us, so that's what they claimed. And they had not the faintest idea how to do it, nor do they today. So in the 60s, they decided to modify these claims and said, well, computers will be as smart as humans. And that, again, is philosophically possible. But, in fact, that didn't happen. Then the military started wanting the results. And so they said, well, we'll do expert systems. They're smart as termites. And, in fact, we've been able to do some pretty good termites in the 70s. Now, I claim that in the 80s, what we want to be studying along these lines are mammalian mentalities. For instance, if in 2 or 3 years we could do something that was an honest squirrel that you could put out into a complex environment and it could complete the learning laid down by its DNA and survive and move along and make more of its kind and so forth, that would be an absolute triumph. Because there is no system today that you can look at and say, if we did this twice as well or 10 times as well, we would get a squirrel. In other words, what I'm saying is that there's a qualitative gap between the kinds of architectures that we're building now for what we call intelligent systems and what we actually need. So what I'm going to talk to you about for most of this talk is an attempt that we're making that's now being funded by Apple and is involving lots of interesting people about how to find out something a little bit more about the way mentalities actually can function. And before I do that, I'd like to do it sort of as an analogy to some of the work that we did at Xerox PARC many years ago. And in order to do that, I first have to warn everybody. I've discovered it. People used to complain when I gave talks that I would rib IBM too much. But in fact, so I made up this sign to warn everybody that if you don't like hearing IBM jokes, now's a good time to leave. And of course, the first IBM joke is that you can't do this slide on IBM equipment. It's done on an Apple laser writer. Now, one of the funny things about the difference between designers and problem solvers is that the designers often don't know what problem they're working on. Problem solvers usually have goals that they're trying to reach, and designers usually have nothing better than directions. Directions are kind of fun because they outlast goals. They're stronger than goals. They're like a magnetic field or what a salmon smells when he is working his way upstream. He doesn't know where he's going, but he can tell when he's closer. And in order to work with areas in the future where we don't know what the answers are going to be and we don't want to prejudice what we're trying to do, we try and come up with simple metaphors. The one we came up with long ago at Xerox PARC was this notion of a pencil. That instead of a desk or instead of a car, we could think of a computer as being our information vehicle, which is pretty much what it is today. We thought, gee, a pencil is a fantastic information medium. We wait until kids are 18 to teach driving, and we don't want to wait until they're 18 in order to teach reading and writing, although it seems like that's happening these days. But generally, we'd like to have the dominant ways of communicating in our society reach people as young as possible. Pencil is so portable you can carry other things too. Right? And you can't say that about too many computers. 0.5 herniations per block is not portability. So one of the tests we had for is it a personal computer back in 1970 is would you be willing to do anything so mundane as to write down your grocery list on it, take it in to the supermarket, and be willing to walk out with 2 bags of groceries? Okay? In other words, right now, almost all systems, including lap computers, would fail that test. In fact, how many people have their computer with them right now? I rest my case. It's really when technology starts being used for mundane things that it's inserted itself into our lives. I was really amazed when I went to Xerox in 1970 to discover that 38% of their domestic copy revenues were from outlaw copying, like party announcements and picnics and so forth. It was a large part of their business, and they claimed that the other 62% was largely there because of the 38%. In other words, when xerography becomes a way of life, you do it casually. And thus, you have to be able to, this is something that people never understood. In order to get people to Xerox at all, you have to break down the barriers. And one of the ways to do that is to be able to use it for other things than official purposes. Now, unfortunately, instead of this pencil, what our industry, the best our industry has been able to come up with so far is something like this, which is also a way of writing a letter. You can jackhammer a letter into the asphalt of the street. You can pry up the asphalt, put it on a truck, and carry it across town and deliver your message. It is definitely an information manipulator. And of course, it's painted blue for good reason. Now, come on, you know I'm speaking the truth. So, in other words, it's not a question of being able to formally satisfy the ability to impress information into some medium. That's not what counts. What counts is how many barriers there actually are to doing it casually, because it's only when it's done casually that the thing starts modifying our ways of doing thinking. One of the interesting things about, and this is more of an observation than a slam at IBM, but if you observe people using IBM computers, they do not sit at them for any great length of time. And the reason is that the display is not good enough to keep them there without eye strain. It doesn't matter whether it's a monochrome display. When you display light characters on a black background, we discovered at Xerox long ago that your eye dark adapts. So when you move from that mostly dark display down to the light papers that you're looking at that are spread around, your eye light adapts. And in fact, what's going on is a constant change in your iris when you look at a display like that. And that's why the Macintosh, and as were the machines at Xerox PARC, flood the screen with light. It's the key. That display was designed in 1972 at Xerox to allow people to sit at it for 6 and 7 hours at a time without any eye strain. And it's only when you're sitting at the thing for that long that you start using it for what it's really good for, which is thinking. One other slide that I like to show, just so we understand a little bit about where we are. I used to be a molecular biologist before I got into this racket, and once a few years ago when I had nothing better to do, I decided to look at an intestinal bacterium, E. coli. We have millions of them in our digestive tract, and they're rather small. They're about 1/500th the size of a typical mammalian cell, typical body cell in our body. And if you take that E. coli and model it as an information system, which it is, and leave out electrons, as you model it only at the level at which it really represents information, then one of them contains 100 billion bytes. That's a lot. That's 12 million 8K games cartridges. 50,000 2-megabyte Lisa systems. For people in the humanities, 600 Louvre paintings at a resolution so high you can't see the pixels. That's a lot. And you can tell what company I was working for. I showed the president of Atari this one day, and I said, there are 12 million 8K games cartridges in one E. coli. And he looked at me and said, how can I get some of them E. coli? And I said, you can either use a feather or look at yesterday's stock reports. The point is that even though there's been a fair amount of relative progress in the last 40 years, we aren't even close in dealing with computer stuff to building systems that are anywhere near as complex as some of the simplest living things. We don't know very much about dynamic architecture. One of the things that's true about living things, for instance, is that they're not very fragile. Pull out a few molecules from an E. coli, it's not going to care. It'll keep on going because it's enormously redundant and it's designed to keep on functioning. You pull out a few bytes from the average code on any kind of PC and it will crash. There's no redundancy there at all. And so what we're dealing with right now are very carefully poised houses of cards that are just balanced up by the applications programmers and shipped out with the hope that they will work. So there's many long ways to go. Now let me show you very quickly. I think I have to go up on the podium here to get my remote control. Let's see, I think these two turn it on, yeah. Now this is an example of what I claim is the first personal computer. It goes back to 1962, and this is an amazing machine that actually had virtual memory on it, on those tapes. About 2,000 of them were built, and mostly for biomedical technicians. And when DEC saw this machine, DEC was a young company when this machine was done, they said, boy, what a great way of building small mainframes. But nobody's used to looking at displays, so we'll make that an option. And nobody knows about virtual memory, so we'll put files on those tapes. And out of this machine, the mini computer was born. But it's sobering to realize that the good idea, that of personal computing, was right here, and nobody could see it back in 1962. Now here's the first personal computer I did, called the Flex Machine. It was done in 1967. And this is a picture of it on its own display. So you can sort of see what display graphics were like. This machine had two interesting characteristics. First, it was a great coffee warmer. Had 700, they didn't really have integrated circuits back then, just barely, and it had 700 little chips in it, and put out an enormous amount of heat. The other thing it had was a very powerful language on it that I designed that completely repelled every user we ever stuck on the machine. And that was the first time in my life that I realized that graduate students and other people were different. The graduate students loved this. It was incredibly powerful. And we started dimly getting the idea that actually it wasn't enough to just have the strict form and built-in power, that there had to be some way to access it. Also, the same year of 1968, this gadget appeared, which is the world's first flat panel display. Now, this has been a technology that has never gotten to us in any practical form, but it goes back a long ways. And we realized back then there was only going to be a matter of years before all of the hardware that took cubic feet in computers back then would be able to be put on the back of something the size of a notebook. That's where this idea of personal computing really was born, of something that you could carry around casually. We did this machine at Xerox PARC in order to study how all this worked. This is the Alto computer, and this is the forerunner of the Lisa and the Macintosh. It's 1972. It's about twice the speed of the Macintosh. We built about 2,000 of these. Xerox spent somewhere in excess of $100 million on this experiment back then. So they really wanted to see what it would be like, what computing in the 1980s would be like. And so they were willing to spend any amount of money to find out. And they hired people who were willing to sit down. We just simply anticipated what the computing power would be like in the 1980s and then built a bunch of them using 1970s technology. So this is the first bitmap screen. This picture was taken in 1972. And I already mentioned why we decided to go black on white. It's the same reason that we use paper black on white, in that you want to keep your eyes adapted to what the ambient lighting actually is. Windows were invented at that same time in order to allow access to things, but also to greatly magnify the display area. And finally, almost all of the work that we did at Xerox PARC was done for children. This is very important. One of the things we discovered that when we were trying to design this stuff for adults, there was always a place where the design process got hard, and we would say to ourselves, oh, what the heck, we'll send them to training school for 2 weeks. Because that's what people do with adults when something gets hard. We'll send them to get training. And for the children, though, we didn't want to send them to training school. They were already suffering in school enough. So we wanted to give them easy access so they didn't have to learn. And in fact, during the last several years of the experiment with children, we worked with about 900 children over a period of 4 years. The last several years, we didn't teach the children to program at all. We just left the materials lying around, and they learned it on their own. Now, I'd like to show you, give you an example of a couple of things that some children did. How many people have used Mac Draw, not Mac Paint, but Mac Draw? It's the one where the drawing, the object nature of the things that you draw is retained, so you can move things around and make copies of things and move them. That is an applications program done by some talented people at Apple. And our mode today is that we go to a store and we buy a program written by somebody else. It's called an application. And then we use whatever it allows us to do. What I'd like to show you is this example. Now, here's a similar system. This was done in 1975. And I think I'd be better off if I switched over like that.
Susan's program uses a pointing device called a mouse.
Well, you see a little handle there. She has a menu down in the lower right-hand corner there. She's changed the color.
Her system is quite general and allows size, sizes, and colors to be changed at will. Many instances can be created from a shape description.
Now, I think to realize about this is that this applications program was written by a 12-year-old girl. She wrote the application program herself, and she wrote it after less than 3 months of programming. And the program itself was less than a page long. Less than 50 lines she had to write in order to do this thing from scratch. And the system was not set up beforehand with the building blocks of graphics. This is a scratch program, one of the first instances in history when an actual tool was done by a novice user.
She is starting to build a truck. The idea of a system to aid drawing is something every child understands intuitively because they already know about drawing in school. In order to design and build the system, however, Susan had to gain a fairly deep symbolic understanding of some of the semantics of drawing. Even more important, she has started to grasp the very powerful notions which have something to do with inventing comprehensive models that not only capture her desires and ideas, but which also run.
Now here's another example. This was done by a 15-year-old boy. This is about 80 lines of code, about a page and a half. He was interested in ham radio, and he hated to draw circuit diagrams, so that one of the first programs he wrote was this tool to allow him to make circuit diagrams. You can see his hand on the mouse here. And again, this is a from-scratch program. The menu of shapes is down below, and you see every once in a while where the cursor is, a pop-up menu like that will appear where he's put tools that he uses very often, where he doesn't want to reach for them. So he has things like open and close dots. And you can pick up things like he's picking up a battery here, and he can rotate it and position it. I particularly like this one as an example of novice user programming because less than 10 years before this was done, a PhD thesis was awarded for a system that wasn't as good. We felt that there was some hope. Now, the reason I show this is the logical extension of where we are today over the next 3 to 5 years. So the next step in the short term in personal computing for people is going to be easy ways for people to tailor and build their own vertical applications. You see sort of very messy and annoying attempts today in the form of keyboard macros and 1, 2, 3 and other abortions like that. The idea behind them is good, namely that people should be able to customize and capture their actions and be able to play them back later. It's just that the people who designed it had no idea how important it was and how important it was in order to make customization really easy and understandable. The next round of systems we'll see in the next 3 to 5 years will be like this. Systems will not be written in machine code anymore. They'll be written in a very high-level language. These children were programming in Smalltalk, which is one of the first completely object-oriented languages. And the size of the code you have to write to get something in Smalltalk compared to, say, Pascal or C is about a factor of 80. And this allowed, we discovered that children, and especially most novice users, let me stop this because they're just further examples. We discovered that most novice users could program and could understand their programs as long as the programs weren't larger than one visual field. And that meant practically back then about 2 pages or about 100 lines of program. And we discovered by experiments that it didn't matter what kind of language it was, whether it was a very low-level language like BASIC or a medium-level language like Logo or a high-level language like Smalltalk, that there was a way of teaching each of these. But in fact, the ability, the short-term memory ability of novices was much stronger than the level of the language. That in fact, one of the differences between a novice and an expert is how much they have to use their short-term memory in place of what experts are able to use their long-term memory and chunking. That got us very interested in how people's minds work. Let's see if I can go on. Oh, everything's fine. I think maybe I just turned it off, but let me go forward. This way. Are the slides on? Oh, great, thanks. Well, the legend on this slide actually says how people's minds work. And I can tell you that when we started this at Xerox PARC, we really did not want to go into psychology. What we were hoping to be able to do is to just simply sit down and have a few bright ideas and have them be right and be able to implement them, and then we would have succeeded. But in fact, what we discovered was that we had not the faintest idea of what was going on inside of people's heads. Now here's an example of why we're confused. If you look at this for a while, you'll see there's something wrong with this picture. How many people see it? Okay. I was very taken by, I gave this talk in Japan this summer, and it was wonderful that the Japanese took just as long as we did to see that. So what's wrong with this picture? Mouth is upside down. What else? The eyes are upside down. Okay, here's what it looks like right side up. Now notice the huge difference, even though you knew what was wrong before. Notice the huge difference in reaction here. Can we go back? There we go. Okay. So this I swear to you, this is exactly the same. Whoops. This is exactly the same picture. Okay, now I have to move it back because people won't listen to me when it's the other way. Now this illustrates, it happens that this is a good illustration in a talk of something that's very complex to understand, and that is, it is an illusion, in fact a theatrical illusion that we all live in, that reality is objective and seamless. But in fact, the truth is that we all live in a dream and hallucination of our own devising. And you can start to see some of the seams in this dream by certain kinds of visual illusions. This is one that is understood very well. So on the under right-hand side of the brain, where facial recognition is done, there are two areas more than an inch apart that are contributing to what you see here. One of them is the thing that allows you to see faces and clouds. It's just generally good at recognizing face-like things. And it's reporting an upside-down face-like thing. It's also this area that scares children when they're around 5 and 6 years old in the twilight. So everything starts looking like monsters. And what it's seeing is it's picking up shadow configurations that are thing-like but are not human-like. So it's saying this is a face-like thing, and about an inch away is a patch of brain tissue that only cares about eyes and mouth. And it's saying that's an okay mouth and those are okay eyes. So there's very little conflict here. Upside down, but the eye is a mouth guy says, that's fine. No problem. Go to this one, and the face guy is saying that's a right side up face-like thing, and the eyes and mouth guy is saying something is very wrong here. And we can imagine why we might have that reaction, because an expression like that might mean you're going to die in the next 10 seconds. And in fact, all mammals, this is something that's not peculiar to humans, all mammals will have that reaction to that picture. If you'd like to try it out on a dog, I suggest you pick a small one. So in other words, what I'm working up to here is the idea that inside our skull is not something as they believe in Washington, that perception is reality. This is a frightening statement when you think about it. But something much more like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which has the great line, reality is frequently inaccurate. In other words, what is going on here? Another good way is, since this is a good crowd to talk to, you'll go along with anything, right? So hold up your left hand with your thumb up like this. If you have 2 quarters in your pocket, you can pick a quarter up and hold it, but your thumb is pretty good. And then take your other hand and hold it about halfway, as close to halfway as you can measure between the two. You can put it on axis, but it's easier to compare if you just hold it a little bit off axis. And look at the relative size of the thumbs or the quarters. And what most people will see is that the further away thumb is about 80% the size of the close one. Right? On your retina, the further away thumb is 1/2 the size. In other words, what you're seeing is not what's there. We don't see what's there, we see what we are. And there are dozens of examples of that what we're seeing is actually a recreation of partly cued in by what's actually out there, but mostly cued in by what we've learned. If we were a primitive society right now, we would not be able to see perspective very well. Medieval art, there is no perspective, because in medieval art, which is a primitive, non-self-conscious society, you're a member of the community, not an individual. And when a community looks at a building, they look at it from all angles at once. And when they draw that building, they draw it as it is. So they draw all walls as being the same height, because that's what they are. Same way as children draw a table showing all 4 legs, because that's what it is. Seeing it from all angles at once. It's only when you are in a society like ours, sprung from the Renaissance, where we think of ourselves as individuals and having individual points of view, that something like perspective could be invented. In fact, perspective was invented for the first time ever in a solid way less than 40 years after the printing press became available. And those were not that was not just a coincidence. One caused the other. The book that you can take with you detribalizes you because it's something you can go off. For the first time ever in history, you could learn something without being in a room with a bunch of other people and have it be a social event. And that's where individualism comes from, and that's why perspective was invented when it was. These things are really mysterious because our society seems like the only reasonable one that there is. But in fact, most of the things that we think are inevitable are a product of the culture that we grew up in. So dealing with, let me move off this. So dealing with people, oh, I'm sorry, I went backwards. There we go. So dealing with these issues means that what we're dealing with is not something simple, but we're actually dealing with multiple mentalities that work inside people's heads. That we found very confusing. And we got very interested in 3 of these. And we all know about, I think we all know about the French psychologist Piaget now. And Piaget thought that children went through 3 major stages. One was a doing stage when they're very young. An object is to grab it, a hole is to dig it. In other words, objective reality is in the actions necessary to make tactile contact with it in some way. Later, there's a stage which is very visual. That's the one where, in the Piaget experiment, where you just pour from the squat glass into the tall, thin one. Everybody's heard of that, right? Children in this stage will say there's more water in the tall, thin glass because it looks that way. And then around 11 or 12, children shift into a symbolic stage where they start using facts and logic in order to drive things. This is the first stage in which you can decouple yourself from current reality. Now, in a wonderful series of experiments in the 1950s, Jerome Bruner showed something very startling, that these things that Piaget thought were phases of development were actually completely separate mentalities, all working at the same time. There's a change of dominance. So one of the experiments he did was to take a child who would say that there's more water in the tall, thin glass and pour that water, and then he'd immediately cover up the tall, thin glass. And the child would say, oh, but there must be the same amount of water because where could it go? And Brunner would take it away, and the kid would look at the glass, and he would say, oh, but there must be more. Look at it. And Brunner would cover it up again, and the kid would say, but there must be the same amount of water because where could it go? So if you have any 10-year-olds you'd like to torment, this is a great way to do it, because what Brunner was doing is bouncing this kid back and forth, that he was showing that the child was dominated by this mentality, but in fact the other one was functioning, and it was by preventing the kid from seeing what was going on that the kid could start using this. In fact, this is a very powerful way of learning things, and Brunner came up with some curriculum ideas that said it's a great idea to be able to learn things in this order, the same order that recapitulates our own development, and thus we have more than one mentality to fall back on when our symbolic, fact-ridden way of doing things fails. Great mathematician Hadamard did a study of the 100 most creative mathematicians in the world, which being French, he included himself in the list. In fact, he was. And so he interviewed all of these people who were friends of his, asking them, how do you do your thing? And only a few of the mathematicians, I think it was 3, claimed that they used mathematical symbology at all. This is something to think about when you have children in school and what they're being taught is only mathematical symbology. The 100 great mathematicians in the world don't use mathematical symbology because that is a way of expressing mathematics, not doing it. They all claim to have visual interaction with the ideas, and an amazing 30% of these 100 mathematicians, including Einstein, said they had tactile sensations. Einstein said, I have feelings of a kinesthetic or muscular type. So Einstein did mathematics by feeling. He could feel the multidimensional spaces he was dealing with. So we see here an illustration of the cliche that genius is the ability to recapture childhood at will. But another way of looking at it is what these people were that we think of as supremely creative were doing is using these other mentalities that are mostly shut down in most adults. And these mentalities have completely different rules, and this is the key to my talk today. This is the most important idea. This one is Aristotelian. It loves things like A is not A. Everybody learned that in college, right? A is not A. A thing can't be itself and something else at the same time. Sounds logical. Very logical. This one has a completely different set of rules. In the visual arts, the graphic arts, figure and ground exchange. That's A is not A. The thing and its opposite are the same. This is like alchemy here, good and evil, darkness and light. Okay? In other words, the visual mentality is one that groups not by logical structures, but by abstract similarities. Those similarities are figurative rather than logical. So this area is a very mushy place to live, right? Because almost anything is possible. However, it is the world's greatest place to go to for a little vacation because here the rules are completely different. And most creativity, I assert, is done by traveling to these areas, getting stuff that couldn't possibly be true, and bringing it back out here where it can be worked on by logic. In other words, what I'm saying is logic is a weak method. It only works when you have the right context. And the saying I made up at Xerox PARC was that point of view is worth 80 IQ points. In other words, if you want to multiply two numbers together and you happen to be in 60 AD, you're in trouble. You have to be a genius. If you want to find out where Mars is going to go in 1325, you have to be a genius because you're in Ptolemaic astronomy or Roman numerals. Neither one of those are a context in which logic is simple for what you want to do. But by rotating or changing our paradigm, as Kuhn has called it, we find the context in which logic works. Now the problem with the way most people are taught in school and in American business, as De Bono pointed out, is that one of the main things American business does when they get into trouble is to redouble their efforts. Right? Usually the reason they're in trouble is that they're in the wrong place. This is like digging for gold and you've dug down 5 feet and you haven't found any, so you decide to dig twice as fast. If the gold is 20 feet to the side, you're going to dig all the way to China before you find it because creativity is not single dimensional and logic is. So a simple characterization of Western civilization at its best is our civilization is a civilization in which artistic ideas are conceived the way they are in every society, which is down here at a visceral and iconic level. The difference between Western civilization and all other civilizations on the planet is that we can then apply centuries of technique to those new ideas in order to bring them out. That's what's the difference between our music and the music of other cultures. Our music isn't any more heartfelt. It isn't any more beautiful than other cultures. But our music is the only music that has applied technique to art. Okay? And that is a difference. That is a civilization that is able to use more than one way of dealing with the world. So we got very interested in these ideas, and I want to give you an example, two quick examples of why it's powerful. Here's an experiment you can do with some children. Children are really fun because they'll go along with most things, no matter how wacky they seem. The idea here was to get children to draw circles in Logo. It's a programming language, fairly easy to use. And you take a 5-year-old who's in this body phase, you take a 10-year-old who's in the visual, and a 15-year-old in the symbolic, and you try and get them to draw circles. Well, the way you do it with the 5-year-old is you get them to close their eyes and say, well, make a circle with your body. So the 5-year-old starts doing this. And after a while you ask, what are you doing, Johnny? And he says, well, I'm going a little and turning a little over and over. So if you type that into Logo, you'll get a perfect circle. And that's because the 5-year-old knows differential equations. Right? Circle is that thing of constant curvature, and so the change in curvature is 0. And that's exactly what a person's body knows how to do. In other words, egocentric coordinates are something that it took mathematicians thousands of years to arrive at. Differential geometry was invented by Gauss in the 1840s. So it was only 130 years ago that mathematicians started using what a 5-year-old will use instinctively. And Logo is able to deal with those egocentric coordinates on purpose for exactly this reason, because children of that age don't think the way adults do. Well, if you take a 10-year-old, 10-year-old is too grown up to do something as silly as the 5-year-old will do. And he's in a visual stage, and he wants to draw lots of circles. So you give him a compass and let him draw circles. And after a while, he'll figure out that what a circle is a gadget that has, in which the points are the same distance from the rim. So he'll eventually write this Logo program, which is you pick the pen up, go out, measure a distance like 100 out, make a dot, back up to the center, turn 1 degree. Perfect circle. It's what we had to learn in school is the locus of points equidistant from a given point. Okay, much harder way to do it, but you still get a perfect circle. Now, of course, I wouldn't be telling you this story if the 15-year-old succeeded. In fact, the 15-year-old is in this symbolic stage and fails miserably because he knows the most horrible fact ever thought up by the mind of man, which is this one. Right? We all have learned this, but we have to realize that it's in the wrong coordinate system. And even if we're in a This was done by a friend of mine, but I didn't know him then. In 1975, a guy by the name of Tim Galway wrote a book called The Inner Game of Tennis. And this book enraged Harry Reasoner, who was at ABC in those days and had a Sunday afternoon show. And Harry, I think, was from Iowa or something, and was a grudging tennis player of the worst kind. He knew damn well that tennis wasn't easy because he'd been trying for 20 years and he still hadn't gotten very good. And so in this person who actually lived in Malibu, California, wrote a book saying that you just really shouldn't try too hard and you could really go out and play tennis fantastically in just an hour or two. Harry Reasoner got very upset, and he sent apparently an ABC hatchet squad out to California to do Tim Galway in. They rounded up a whole bunch of people, I think it's 35 or 40 people, and got them to sign legal affidavits saying that they'd never played tennis in their life. And they took all of these people out in the courts, and they picked the worst one, who was a 55-year-old lady, 40 pounds overweight, 5'2", and a muumuu. And her affidavit said that not only had she never played tennis, but in fact she had not exercised for 20 years. And she tried to get out of it, but they went out and they bought her tennis shoes and so forth. And then on live television one Sunday, they set a clock at the side of the court and said to Tim Galway, you have 20 minutes to teach her how to play tennis. And this is what happened. Now, for people, there are various ways of watching this. This was gotten directly from the television show. And you might, when you look at it, you might try and see if you can guess what he's doing to get results. I'll give you a couple of clues as it goes along, but take a look.
Flies through the air. I want you just to watch it. In the very instant the ball hits the court, I want you to say bounce. In the very instant the ball hits the racket, I want you to say hit. So you just be saying bounce, hit. All you need to do is watch the ball. Okay?
Bounce.
The key of all the exercises in the inner game is to focus the mind's attention
somewhere where it will not interfere with the body's ability to hit the ball automatically. You stand here and Tim will throw you a couple, and you just continue doing the same thing.
So I'm trying to hit it?
Not at first. At first, just say bounce when the ball bounces and hit when you would hit it, but don't hit it. Then after you feel like hitting it, go ahead and hit it.
Okay.
Okay, you might watch your right arm here.
Bounce, hit.
Because something's trying to hit the ball right now.
Hit. Bounce, hit. Bounce, hit.
Okay? When the player is first learning the game of tennis, and when he says bounce, he's also out of the corner of his eye watching me hit the ball. So even though he's not trying to see how I hit it, the image of me hitting it is going right into his memory. You enjoying yourself?
Yeah, it's really fun.
You like that? Okay, here we go. The causal principle in any book written on tennis, about tennis, is to watch the ball. No tennis player really sees the ball enough. And the reason is they get bored. So I try to give them something to see in the ball that's interesting. So we watch the trajectory of the ball, the gracefulness of the line made by the ball as it flies through the air. Always it's the same. Put the mind somewhere where it can stay calm and not get you uptight, but relaxed and interested. Then the body does so beautifully, so beautifully. I might start listening to the ball, boys. Listen to how it sounds in your racket. Hear that?
Yes.
Hear that one? What does that sound like?
Very dull.
So it's like wood. That wood sound. Keep listening and you'll hear the sound that you like pretty soon. Just listen to it. Okay, now listen on this side. Have a girl.
Watch the footwork here.
Okay. Now, be aware that racket is part of your arm. That's it. Just feel it. And try so hard and let it happen. That's it. Do what's comfortable, Molly.
Every time I did start to think, things went wrong.
Just feel it.
And when I just stopped thinking, the body seems to know what to do.
Can you feel with your left hand where it is? There we go. Just way in the back there. Feel it. Okay. Now, I'll tell you what, Molly. We're going to do one other stroke now. And this one's called the serve. And the serve is just like a dance. It's just like a dance. We'll come back here and I'll show you how to do a dance called the serve. Okay? And I've done this dance a little bit, so I'll just do it. Okay. Da-da, da. In fact, you can start humming if you want. The rhythm, like this. Watch this. Da-da, da. Da-da, da. Out loud. Da-da. Okay, now, here's what you do. Once you stand there, shut your eyes, and imagine yourself doing that same dance. You might start humming a little bit. Da, da, as you're doing it, yeah. Okay, now what I want you to do is no thinking, just go do it, quick. Just no thinking, just go serve, yeah. Serve, fine, don't worry about missing. Keep serving, don't think. Go, do, quick. That's it, stop. Fine, again, don't worry about hitting
Okay,
it.
watch the wrist snap here.
Out loud, let's hear it. Out loud, the rhythm. There you go. I get them to hum the rhythm of my serve. So they're not thinking, oh, this is what he's doing with his elbow, this is what he's doing with his hand. They're not trying to remember all that. They start humming. And they see themselves doing very similar things, muscular movements, to what I did. But they're not thinking about it, so it just comes out naturally and fluidly. So that didn't take long. That's called serving. Out.
Out.
She didn't double fault the entire match.
Don't miss it. Good. Come. Okay? Okay, that's your first point in tennis. Score is 15 love.
Fantastic.
Okay, Molly. No need for you to miss.
All of a sudden, everything became effortless. I was just sort of like floating along, you know, and doing what came naturally, you know. And I said, I'm playing tennis. You know, it's really.
This is a 30-ball rally.
Have a clear idea of what you want, then let it happen. Don't try too hard. I'm going to try to make you miss, Molly, because it's going on too long.
He zings a couple at her here.
Get a little bit harder. You just keep watching the ball. They're rooting for you, Mo. Don't do something. Come on, that ball. Oh, it's fine. Mo, that's fine. That's called pass.
Well, when I saw that on television, I said something approximating, holy cow. So what I saw was something I just really, it took me a while to take it in. I eventually got that book and read it, went out and learned tennis myself from what was in the book, and then we started using those ideas very heavily in working with the children. And in fact, the stuff that I showed you in the early part of the children being able to do these applications programs after only a few months was due in part to what you can do with small talk, but the large part of it was due to what you just saw in the several examples I showed you. That in fact, the user interface design and the way the kids approached this was designed to get them into a place where they could be very powerful when they were thinking about things. Not powerful logically, because human beings aren't powerful logically. You know, it took our race, which is supposed to be brainy, more than 200,000 years to go from one kind of stone hand axe to the next, back in the Ice Age, and we really needed that new design. We aren't smart, but what we are able to do is to pick up what other people have already laboriously figured out real easy. And it's that distinction that we have to understand when we're doing schooling. Now, what I'd like to talk to you now about is what the next phase of this, I think, is going to be. As I mentioned, this notion of being able to directly manipulate objects and to create your own tools is one I think it's going to be played out over the next 3 years, and it really is going to be better than what we're doing today. But now let's talk about agents for a bit, because I think I established in the beginning that no matter what we do on this pathway, there are barriers to being able to get further. I, for one, would like to be able to sit down at my computer 10 years from now and be connected with the wisdom of the ages. But in fact, it would be like one of those horrible stories of the 3 wishes in Grimm's fairy tales if that were to happen tomorrow. There I would be connected to the wisdom of the ages and not able to find a single thing. You know, the amount of information that our civilization is accumulating is doubling now every 2.5 years. And what that means is our ability to get at it, at best, is halving every 2.5 years. And so what we're going to wind up with is the ability to do almost anything and the inability to find out anything at all. So we have to stem that tide. And so I'd like to talk to you about agents a little bit. And to do that, I want to give you a couple of examples of agents that have been done in the past. Here's a very simple one, but I think it will give you the idea of how different things are likely to be. This is one that we did when I was at Atari, but it was originally done at MIT.
Blue Hotel.
What color?
Blue.
Where?
There. Create a red Atari
Where?
north of Havana.
Let me see if I can start and stop that again and see if we can get a...
What color?
Green.
Where?
There. Put that
Where?
there. Put that
Where?
there. Name the hotel. The Del Monte Hyatt. Mr. Del Monte Hyatt.
Where?
To the Bahamas. Change your voice.
As you wish.
Create a green sailboat.
Where?
There. Name that. Next year's meeting. Move next year's meeting.
Where?
To Jamaica.
Where?
To Jamaica. Create a red cruise ship.
Where?
There. Name the cruise ship. Corporate research. Delete corporate research.
Well, you have to be careful when you make prophecies like that, because that's exactly what happened to us at Atari. But you get the idea that the interchange with the agent is first going to be done in some more natural way, some way that we're used to. May not be completely in terms of natural language, because nobody knows how to do that. And the agent is also customizable in the sense that you should be able to build your own agent. You don't want to have an agent supplied to you. You'd like to have it built in terms of maybe a cartoon figure, something like that, or something where you can change the voice of it, so on. It's a customizable thing, because the worst thing you can ever do with agents is to think that they're actually intelligent. So almost all of the work that we did when we were at Atari is to find ways of diffusing the notion of intelligence. And one of the ways we found was to, instead of using high-resolution computer images, we use low-resolution cartoon-type images. So here's an example of that we did as a joke. What you'll see here is this is the president of Warner Communications, Manny Gerard, and we wrote a program that would take any photograph and make it into a caricature and be able to animate that caricature. And we had a program that could take voice samples. That I had a phone call with this guy and got his very distinctive voice samples. And then we were able to hook it up to our information systems, such as the one that you saw, and this is the result.
Where is Miami?
Oh yeah, that's right. I've got to move past this.
Designate Miami. Corporate headquarters. Move Atari.
Sorry, I forgot about it. This is the pain of using one of these that doesn't have a scan feature.
Where?
There. Name that. Alan Kay. Move Atari to the right of Warner. Move Alan Kay
Where?
to the right of Atari. Where is Alan Kay?
West Central.
Annotate. Draw.
I guess one thing I should mention here is that I didn't explain is our vision of the personal computer during this phase is, instead of having a notebook-sized machine,
Stop.
the idea was that in the later phase, in the 1990s, what we'll do is we'll wear an ID bracelet, which will probably be a watch. And besides telling us the time, it will tell the computers that are now built in to every wall that it's us walking from place to place. And so this is a model where you could just walk into a room, and the thing on your wrist told the computer in the room that it was you, and it also told the computer in the room where your hand was in space. That's how he was able to point. He's wearing this wristwatch gadget that is kind of a three-dimensional mouse, but it's something that travels with you and you don't have to pick it up or anything. That's what you're seeing there. Now let's see if we can get on to this other example.
Draw. Stop. Restart. Change Alan Kay.
What description?
A cruise ship. Delete Alan Kay.
What command?
Delete.
This is sort of showing the subconscious feelings of researchers.
As you wish.
Okay, so here's a database of the future. Super desktop with all sorts of different things.
Manny.
Hello there.
Manny.
How are ya?
Are you in there?
In this one instant.
Can you help us out? We're in the middle of a hot argument about World War II.
Let me try to take a look at it tonight and let you know. No.
Okay, now here's an example of, you have to realize that the agent here knows nothing about World War II. And we found out that what happens to people when they work with an agent is they expect it to be an oracle. And it's exactly the way 6-year-olds feel about the librarian the first couple of times they go to the library. The librarian is supposed to know the answer. And they don't realize that the librarian is really a guide. So as soon as they mention World War II, what Manny did is say, oh, well, let me look it up and I'll talk to you tonight. Because he knows enough about, all he knows about World War II is it is a huge area. And the chances of him delivering on anything they want is extremely low. So what he's doing here is diffusing their expectations before they start asking him any hard questions.
Well, we're in a big rush. We have a bet with Apple.
Terrific.
Okay, so our question is, couldn't we have invaded Europe earlier?
Well, you're dead right. Except we fucked that one up.
Why couldn't Hitler invade Russia?
He is a complete banana. He drives any organization totally crazy, screaming and shrieking and carrying on.
Can you show us?
Okay.
Why did the strategy fail?
I'm going to show off and be wrong.
So here he retrieves a simulation, which is game Eastern Front, where you can actually try and go through the problem.
Gotta be kidding.
Oh, that looks hard.
That's just a killer.
I think maybe a round from the east could work.
Well, let me tell you, you're the only man who most people avoid it like the plague.
Well, thanks, Manny. Having fun in there?
Terrific.
Thanks for your help.
Oh, see, I don't know much, but I know a few things.
See ya.
Bye-bye. So long.
So, well, requires a certain amount of chutzpah actually to, Manny actually gave us permission to show that in public. But the idea back then was that in the agent user interface, what you're trying to do now is set up theatrical expectations that aren't going to be zapped by reality. And so what the interface here is trying to be helpful, and it can go off and do lots of things for you, but what it must do is always subliminally remind you that it's not intelligent. And one of the reasons we picked cartoon characters is they were the one anthropomorphic thing that we knew about that were like people, but people didn't expect to be smart. Most cartoon characters do not act as though they're intelligent. And I think that this strategy is going to work in the future. Now let me, so I know time is running on, let me show you very quickly about what we're doing with children in Los Angeles. This is an example of what we expect to do with kids, and that is to get them to think about intelligent behavior by studying the way animals cope with things. Let me give you an example. I'll just take fish as a group that aren't too smart, but I think you'll get the idea here.
What if a cartoon character could play with you?
The Interactive Animation Group at Corporate Research is creating an interactive character through a synthesis of ideas from artificial intelligence, cartoon animation, perception, and theater. We are looking at 4 areas: a behavior model, graphic representation, expressiveness, and tools for an animator.
Up in the air with his legs up in the air.
A character must behave, making its own decisions about how to react to changing situations. A simple rule-based decision model causes interesting motion in this Atari 800 example.
The smart thing is attracted to the food and repelled from the shark. Follows a path that's a reasonably intelligent path to follow.
Our colleagues at Cambridge Atari Research have built a general-purpose behavior model which can act as a brain for many different characters. But how can we provide a way for this brain to tell us what it's thinking? Our computer characters must puppeteer their graphic representation in ways that the viewer will see their thought processes. We must provide our characters with graphics they can change in real time. Puppets who pull their own strings. We do not want to simulate real-life movement. We want something more expressive and exaggerated, which will communicate meaning more precisely. Disney animators have provided us a set of rules. We find more rules for expressive gesture in traditions taught to dancers, mimes, and actors. In perceptual psychology, we find explanations of how exaggeration may help us understand our perceptions. We see this computer-generated dot pattern as a person walking. Can we gain control over rules so simple, so powerful, that we can express complex behaviors, even emotions, with interactive graphics? Absolutely. An important aspect of this project is building tools which can be used to create expressive interactive characters. The animator must create movement cycles and provide ways for the character to modify these cycles. Great.
That's very cute.
What will we be able to do with interactive characters? Children of all ages find animals fascinating. Cartoon animal characters are behavioral toys which a child could befriend.
What?
A group of characters comprising an ecosystem could be an entertaining learning tool, demonstrating interactively dynamic and complex ideas like the balance of nature or how society functions. A dance machine could create graphics which change with the dancer's movements.
Now,
Okay, well, you get the idea. So the idea is that what we're going to do is try and not do intelligence that we think of as being anthropomorphic, but intelligence that would be acceptable in the animal domain. And in the elementary school in Los Angeles, we're working with 2nd and 3rd graders and 5th and 6th graders in a project that will allow them to do something like this, is to take a shape and stretch it, edit it, smooth it out, show it what to do, and then start to give it behavior patterns that aren't just stimulus response, but behavior patterns that lead to true learning. And many of these are field kind of ideas. So, and these are examples of what the user interface will probably look like, that people will be showing examples in forms of images, dragging things around and so forth, and the system will be assimilating them into a larger pattern. There's a lot there. So one of the problems in this project, just as it was when we were trying to reduce applications programs that were 50 or 60 bytes long to a page of Smalltalk, is we have to find a way of collapsing ideas into something much more powerful so that the number of things that people have to worry about is much less. Then, of course, a simple test is when you make a sample fish, you should be able to stick it into an aquarium, and if you knock on the screen, the fish should be able to do something in response to it. So the fish have to be able to sense. They might have to eat each other, because it's very hard to build in motivation to these characters without having some goals that they are trying to work on. And it's very important to have a complex environment that can complete the learning. So the children have to build the environment also. Here, for instance, this is one iconic way of dealing with the dynamics of a coral reef. Here's an example of an actual system that was done last year and shown at the National Graphics Convention. And people could sit down. This was in the art exhibit, which is kind of interesting. It's thought of as being a kinetic art. You could sit down and design your fish, and you could give the behavior patterns of the fish and how they were to learn, and show here there are rocks and various kinds of algae and so forth. And the fish were animated in 3 dimensions, and would go about their business. Another example is to be able to see this complex environment from the mind's eye, if you will, of each of the characters. So here is seeing a frog and the feet of a bird from a fish point of view. Here's looking at things from the heron's point of view. Here's looking at things from the frog's point of view. And the experience of the children is to be able to all be looking in from their own points of view into this single world. One of the things that we feel is very important, that if school did nothing else to children than just one thing, and that is the idea of teaching children that there's more than one way of looking at things, more than one perspective, it would have done far more than what it's trying to do now. It's one of the disasters of the way school is being run, is that far too often things are thought of as being facts, and this is the truth. This is a relativistic system that tries to show that truth is something that is much of it is in the mind of the beholder, and each of these characters has a different way of apprehending the world. Now, one of the problems with a system like this is that the children, after a while, might think that they're playing God. And in fact, we have to defuse that, because we really don't know how animal mentalities work. And we don't want the children to think that what they're doing is building an animal mentality. When we did musical synthesis at Xerox PARC, we had actual harpsichords and other musical instruments in the room, so that when the children built a timbre, they could understand the difference between the simulation and the real thing. So one of the plans is to defuse by moving into fantasy after we've built fish that can motivate around. So we give the animals some personality. We can make fanciful animals. Here's an example of an animal that could exist 50 million years from now. It's a very reasonable product of evolving processes. There's another example of that. One of the things you might wonder is whether these, what would a fish look at on television if it had television? In other words, one of the nice things about this 101 Dalmatians shot is the notion that there are also social activities and portrayals within portrayals. And finally, we get to this notion of what should things look like. Now, I personally hate current-day 3D graphics. Not because people haven't worked hard on it, but I don't like the way it looks. It looks too much like plasticine, shiny, it's not organic enough. And one of the people we're working with on this project two interesting people. One is Jim Henson of the Muppets, to do physical models that the children will be able to animate. And I'm working with the head animator of The Fox and the Hound from Disney to find a graphic look that is much more organic, that can still be done by computer graphics. This is an example from Fantasia, probably the best animation that has ever been done in history, in which every frame was airbrushed. So you get this marvelous it's like animated pastels. There's another example of stuff. And this is what we expect the simulated computer world to look like, something with this kind of power to it. Let me give you an example of that. This is an example of computer animation. Let's see, I think that's just about it, yeah. This is an example of computer animation done by this animator, Glenn Keane, from Disney. And I think you'll see that it's completely different from any computer animation you've ever seen before. And this shows the process of creating it. This is quick because it takes a long time to do these things. So they'll say, don't blink here. I think you'll see the whole feel is much different. So this is all done in computer. So we expect it to look something like that. Now let me, so I think we're way out of time. Let me sum up by saying that telling you a couple of user interface jokes that I think are appropriate to what I've been talking about today. The first one is what we call the Mexican Airlines joke. And it was a almost true story of a friend of mine who had to fly from Mexico City down to the Yucatan Peninsula. And he got to the airport and saw that the plane was an incredibly old DC-3 with paint peeling off it and oil dripping out of the engine. And he was very worried. He looked inside and he saw that in the cockpit that half of the instruments had been removed from there, just holes there, and the other ones were twisted about at crazy angles. He thought, oh no, I'm going to die on this trip. But he had to go, so he got on. They had a terrible takeoff, and they were dodging mountains down there. And he decided he would look in the cockpit and see what the pilot looked like. And he poked his head in the cockpit and saw up on the control panel that every needle was pointing straight up. In other words, this pilot had solved the user interface problem, the one that you want to solve first and foremost, and that is, how can I tell when everything is all right, and how can I tell when something is wrong? Any instrument that wouldn't conform to that, he just ripped out, and he twisted all the other ones so that normal meant up. Now, if you think about that, that is a heck of a good idea. And the people who had designed that cockpit had probably been designing cockpits for 10 or 15 years, and they never thought of having an iconic representation for goodness. Now, it's sobering to realize that according to the Air Force figures, that 62% of all of their jet fatalities in the Air Force are single pilot errors. There's no other plane in the sky, and they think that most of them have to do with the inability of controlling a Mach 2 or 3 aircraft and understanding what state it's in by these current day instrumentation. Really sobering, something to think about in any kind of computer system that requires interaction. And the other joke is a Winston Churchill joke. And there are many wonderful Winston Churchill jokes. They all have the format of him being at a party. He was well known to be able to function much better than ordinary people under the influence of whiskey. And usually the joke takes place at one stage of the party or another. This particular one was early in the party. And the hostess came up to Winston Churchill and said, "Mr. Churchill, what can I do? I'm very distraught. A famous earl over there just stole one of my silver salt shakers." And Churchill looked at her and he stuck his cigar in his mouth and he said, "Don't worry, madam, I know what to do." And he went over towards the earl, and on the way he took a silver salt shaker and put it in his pocket. And when he got to the earl, he took it out and said, "I think we've been noticed. Perhaps we should put these back." This is why we won World War II. In other words, if you want to get people to do something, you have to involve them in the same conspiracy. And what personal computing is all about, and the user interface for personal computing, is a conspiracy of man and machine. We need to make that conspiracy better. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Alan will be here a minute if you want to come up.
Yeah, I'll stay for questions. People are welcome to leave.